regeneration pathway. And then all these other metabolites that you're seeing come out of enzymes that are one-way functions. So if they go there, then they're destined for clearance. And you can measure these metabolites in different fluids like urine, blood, and saliva, and you can measure them at different times of day, and you can measure the enzymes themselves in tissue. But all of those measurements are trying to get at a proxy for what the processes are, of course. And it's the processes that are dysregulated in metabolic syndrome. It turns out that the pattern of dysregulation of cortisol in metabolic syndrome looks like this. Your regeneration gets lower, especially in the liver, and your clearance gets really high. So now you're stuck in a situation where your cortisol isn't high enough, and so your production has to go up to compensate for it. And often the production isn't good enough, so your cortisol will be slightly lower with metabolic syndrome. Funnily enough, in the Ebeling paper, they cited another paper by Stimson from 2007, where they were specifically looking at the metabolic effects of low-carb diets and low-fat diets in two groups of men. And they, by design, had both groups lose the same amount of weight, and then they were looking at what happened to cortisol metabolism. And this paper was cited because the end result of that paper was that there was a moderate rise in cortisol in the men on the low-carb diet, and that's indeed true. But the point of that paper was to show that it was only in the low-carb dieters that this specific pattern of cortisol dysregulation was reversed. So their regeneration in the liver went up, and their clearance went down, and their production also went down, and the end result was that there was a slightly higher circulating level of cortisol, and this was evidence that metabolic syndrome was being reversed. So whatever the epidemiology is saying, it's not the case that the higher level of cortisol that's being seen in the people in the low-carb diet is an indication of a progression of insulin resistance. It's quite the opposite. Well, suppose you were a scientist and you were working on an intervention that, instead of it being something you weren't sure had benefit or not, it was something you knew had benefit. And so you put in this intervention, you saw the benefit, and then you wanted to take a bunch of measurements and find out what was behind this. And suppose you found moderately elevated cortisol levels in your subjects. What would you say in that situation? I think you would say, oh, well, maybe that's a mechanism of the benefit, because you already have that presumption. You already have the knowledge that it's beneficial. Well, this is exactly what happens in longevity research. Even short-term dietary restriction can attenuate inflammation and affect metabolic and DNA repair pathways. Mechanisms by which dietary restriction suppresses peripheral inflammation include the elevation of glucocorticoids. So, in other words, enhanced cortisol is part of the mechanism of benefit. And you wouldn't be alone in saying this. I chose only a couple. Here's another. Glucocorticoids are yet another class of hormones that may contribute to the anti-carcinogenic action of dietary restriction. Permit me one more. Another mechanism by which caloric restriction may selectively exert its anti-inflammatory effects is via enhanced, I like that biased word there, endogenous corticosteroid production. So it's considered a benefit to have elevated cortisol, just not to weight loss researchers. There are other similarities between ketogenic diets and the benefits that researchers are finding in the area of longevity induced by caloric restriction. So in both cases, we see an increase in the NAD plus to NADH ratio and an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis. We see a decrease in radical oxygen species, and those are all signs of metabolic efficiency. It's been proposed that the mechanisms by which those are similar is because of the ketone bodies themselves, and not just because of the fuel that they provide, but because of the signaling, which can affect brain-derived neurotrophic factor, nuclear factor kappa beta, and the inhibition of histone deacetylase, which has a proposed mechanism in mood stability as well as lifespan. The fact that there are these similarities, I think, is one of the main reasons that we have this analogy meme going around that ketogenic diets are mimicking starvation. And I think that idea is backwards for reasons I'll get into. Another reason potentially for why we associate ketogenic diets with starvation is because modern medicine was created after agriculture, where we were already having